Week 2 of the Overwatch League proved to be a very interesting 3 days, as we learned quite a bit about the teams across the North American region. For the most part, results went largely as I expected, but there was one upset in particular that in my mind has seriously shaken up the rankings, whilst I also think some of the other results have shined a light on the strengths and weaknesses of many of the other NA teams. Today therefore, I want to bring you all my second weekly power ranking update for the West region after week 2 of the Overwatch League. So without further ado, let's get into it. And so like last week, I think it makes the most sense to start from the bottom, where you can see that I have the Vancouver Titans and Boston Uprising unmoved at 13 and 12, the Paris Eternal dropping 2 places to 11th, and the New York Excelsior in at number 10. Vancouver struggled again this past weekend with a dominant loss to Florida before losing relatively comfortably to New York. That now means that they have lost all 4 of their matches to teams that I have ranked in the bottom half of NA, which honestly tells you all you really need to know about them. Looking at their upcoming schedule, I genuinely don't see the Vancouver Titans picking up a win until week 15, when they face Paris. That's the middle of August. Like Reinforce said on the broadcast, this isn't an untalented group of players, but I don't think they've been set up for success, and I think this season is already a write-off. So unless they can impress against one of the strong sides they face in the future, or another team completely capitulates, then I don't think they'll be moving from last in North America for a very long time. As for Boston, this week yet again saw them compete against an on-paper, similarly matched London side. When it came to the series itself, the Spitfire looked largely in control, with the Uprising having little response to what London threw at them, except for the first 2 maps. Given they've only just squeaked by the Titans in week 1, it's honestly hard to place Boston any higher, and I worry this overly sized roster is starting to impact them in terms of a team lacking consistency and direction. An argument could be made for the Uprising to go above Paris, given how woeful the Eternal were over the weekend. Indeed, just days before their matches this week, we learned that the team had bizarrely dropped Naga, one of the Eternal's most impressive performers from last year, for Wub, formerly of American Tornado. I like Wub, and although he's struggled a bit this weekend, I wasn't very surprised given he's new to this roster, and having had comparatively less time to scrim in Overwatch 2 compared to his contemporaries, so early struggles looked likely. Dropping Naga though feels like poor management, and an easy way to save a bit of money rather than actually fixing a problem that could have easily just been a dip in form and a lack of player confidence. Ultimately, Paris ended up looking far worse in their week 2 loss to the Defiant than they had looked in week 1. Glister is failing to have the impact that I predicted in the preseason, but more alarmingly is the team's insistence on running Zarya, a tank hero that didn't work for them at all. That's not to hate on Vestola, I think he was set up to fail honestly, perhaps by a last minute change in the comp they decided to run. I get the theory behind the Zarya in terms of neutralising the effects of the Ana, a hero whose kit looks particularly strong in Overwatch 2, and certain teams could use her really effectively. But I reckon they could have performed better around space and engage that a Winston would have given them. So with the struggles here, I'm asking myself, where is Dan? If there are any positives to take away, the support line of Dredro and Khan I thought were really impressive, especially considering the dire circumstances around them. And although Paris have suffered 3 rather bad losses, at least they have been to pretty strong teams overall, compared to Boston let's say. So that's why I'm keeping them above the Uprising for now, but should they continue on this downward spiral, then I fear for the team moving forward. Lastly from this group is New York, who picked up a nice win against Vancouver, whilst also taking a map off of the shock. I still can't say I'm overly convinced by this roster, but I can at least see some progress, with Yaki and Flora doing well on the DPS line. So I think they head up these bottom 4 teams, but I'm hesitant to move them up or down at the moment any further. At number 9, up 2 positions however, I believe there is a rather unique team in the London Spitfire, a side whose record looks very impressive. However, we have to acknowledge that they've only really faced 2 extremes in North America, with convincing wins against the teams at the bottom in Vancouver and Boston, whilst losing decisively to the Shock, who sit right at the very top. Looking at just their victory over the Uprising this week, I can understand why London fans are very excited, as they dispatched their opponents far more easily than I had anticipated, with Boston struggling to adapt a little bit to their Rhine Rush comp, which the Spitfire can clearly pilot very effectively, with Backbone in particular impressing me with its Mei. Another positive I wanted to add was that when London brought in Shax on Route 66 to play Tracer, the team played a far more traditional Winston comp and actually looked quite good, giving me a bit more confidence for how they'll manage against better teams moving forward, especially if their Rhine strat gets countered. That's why I've got them in a sort of special tier on their own here, as I do believe they are better than the 4 teams below them, but until they face stiffer competition, I don't think I can realistically rank them with the teams in the middle of the pack just yet. And speaking of that middle of the pack, this is where I had the toughest time with my power rankings update this week, as arguments could be made to swap a few of them round. In the end, I settled on Florida, unmoved at 8, Houston and Atlanta both down 4 spots at 7th and 6th respectively, Toronto still 5th, and lastly the Washington Justice up 2 spaces at 4. It's hard for me to break this down too specifically, but as much as I've been surprised and pleased by the Mayhem's performances so far this season, with Checkmate really standing out on the DPS line. That loss to the Outlaws highlighted to me that they almost perfectly sit in the middle of NA at this moment in time, comfortably beating the teams below them whilst causing some problems but coming up just short against the teams just above them like Houston and the Reign, which is why they have to stay where they are. And speaking of those two sides, the drop in the rankings for the Outlaws in Atlanta primarily come down to what I see as a transition in the meta away from a Doomfist, with both teams struggling to find the same success in Week 2 as they had in Week 1, especially with Winston and Zarya seeing more playtime outside of London. Perhaps this is down to seeing more tape on the Doomfist. Before Sunday, I had these two sides the other way around, with the Reign's heavy defeat to Washington really standing out. But as Houston then almost fumbled against Florida at the end of the weekend, a team who Atlanta for the most part dealt with reasonably well week prior, I felt I had to rank them this way round. But looking at both of these teams, I'm keeping a very close eye on them, as I feel they could yo-yo both up and down depending upon results in week 3, and whether they commit to sticking with the Doomfist. Toronto did really well this week despite only playing one game, with a composed and dominant win over a Paris side on the decline. Chorong again has to get to shout out for another fabulous display, whilst Hisu seemed like he was just farming his opponents. But I had to put Washington above them, as not only do they have the head-to-head, but their 3-0 sweep of Atlanta finally highlighted the impressive class and ability we know they have on this roster, with Happy yet again having the time of his life it looked like. It's hard though, do I trust this team fully? I'm not so sure, but given their loss came to a Dallas side that now looks like a top 3 team, I'm willing to put the Justice at the front of this middle grouping, especially if the Doom indeed is falling out of favour. That leaves us with my top 3 for this week. The LA Gladiators 3rd, a jump of 3 places, the Dallas Fuel in 2nd, rising twice, and for a second week running, the Shock remain in 1st place. Let's first deal with the odd predicament we're left with in the discussion of the Gladiators and the Fuel, two teams that face each other this past week in a series which perhaps should have ended in a 3-0 Gladiators win, rather than the 3-2 Dallas reverse sweep we ended up seeing. I hate to say it, but I have to call out my fellow British lad Funny Astro here, who did fumble with his beats in some of those crucial team fights when LA could have wrapped up the series. And I feel that it was really their inability to deal with the Fuel Zarya that saw them struggle in the second half of that series. All credit to Dallas for this though, who at least in moments are showing a top level of performance that we had predicted we'd see from them in the preseason. And the fact that they did pick up the victory here, deserved or not, shows that they have the ability to clutch even in tight spots. But on the other hand, has always been something that the Gladiators have kind of struggled with. Both of these teams aren't without their questions. A reverse sweep loss for LA is bad enough, but I also noticed that Pattyfan was left out, which concerns me a little for his confidence after a rough week 1. And the team as a whole I don't think is reaching the full potential that I believe it is capable of. Dallas, meanwhile, outside of a dominant win over Washington, which after this week looks much more impressive, just seem a bit Jekyll and Hyde to me, with varying displays from their 3 matches so far. And that's why I decided I can't put either team at number 1. The Shock, meanwhile, continue to impress with a very strong showing in their victory over the Outlaws to start the weekend. Just like week 1, all of their rookies have come out the gates on fire, with Proper and Sam continuing to put in excellent DPS displays, whilst Kaluj again seems really assured as a team solo tank. However, just like my last power ranking video, I have to highlight Finn once more, who for me is currently the front runner in the Alarm Rookie of the Year competition, with another 2 brilliant performances on Ana. If his players can keep up this momentum, the sky's the limit for their potential, especially with a coach like Krusty at the helm. If I had one question about them though, it's how they would perform against teams like Dallas and the Gladiators, where their relative inexperience might come back to bite them, especially as the Shock do seem to be dropping maps here or there to teams below them. But right now they're the team that's impressed me the most, and that's why I've kept them at the top of the West region. So that's my Overwatch League 2022 North American Power Ranking update after week 2. Now I want to hear what you all think down in the comments below. Which teams do you disagree with the placement of in this power ranking? If you enjoyed though, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe. And next I'll be bringing you all my predictions for the upcoming week of North America and at last APAC matches. So until then, I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day.